Well, a united front of unions and social movements have come together to propose alternative ways to address both the immediate and longer-term challenges of the country's energy system. On the line to talk about that, I have Dominic Brown from the Alternative Information Development Center, who are the conveners of the initiative. And here in studio, I have Trevor Shaku from the South African Federation of Trade Unions, one of the union federations that form part of the initiative. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time.
Good evening, and thanks for having us.
Let me start with you, Dominic, if I may. Explain to us how the initiative came about in the first instance.
So, thanks for having us. The initiative came about in light of government's proposals to deal with the load shedding crisis. We convened trade unions across various federations, as well as independent trade unions, as well as social movements, to come to terms with the energy crisis in the country and evaluate government's responses to the energy crisis, and to see what is a common response that we can develop together. And we felt that government's proposals are largely inadequate, but we can get into that details in a moment, I hope.
Trevor, you decided to form part of this bloc that's looking at possible solutions. Why?
We think that the South African government is actually failing the people, but also has taken advantage of the demobilization of the working class organizations across the country since 1994. The student movement has been demobilized politically. The trade union movement itself has been demobilized. The community and civic organizations have been demobilized. So we thought that we should forge a united front of these great movements of the working class, through which we will obviously form a bloc that can wage a fight back against the failures of government, and not just only in fighting load shedding, but also in other areas of our governance in this country.
Dominic, what are you putting on the table as alternatives to what we are experiencing?
So, I mean, in the first instance, we agree that we need to deal with the load shedding crisis urgently, recognizing the huge costs that it has on the economy, socially, on our healthcare, etc. And as looking at this, we think we must look at the facts, and we see that there's an energy gap of about 6 gigawatts. This is how much the electricity shortfall between how much is being produced and how much is being demanded is currently. And for us, looking at this, the quickest and most effective way to increase the energy supply is to fix Eskom and to restore the existing fleet. And there's approximately 19 gigawatts of unplanned or planned outages at Eskom due to maintenance and servicing problems. And given this is especially important given how the private sector will not be able to bring sufficient electricity onto the grid quickly enough. And this is exemplified in the fact that, just by way of an example, bid window 5 of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program is expected to only get about 1 gigawatt of capacity on the grid by sometime next year, out of a total of potentially 2 gigawatts of electricity. And that other extra gigawatt, or 0.95 gigawatts, will only be possible if they dramatically reduce the localization requirements, how much of the inputs needs to be sourced locally. And so this doesn't even take into account the fact that this the renewable energy that's coming onto the grid, and don't get me wrong, we need to transition to renewables, but renewable energy is not a like-for-like comparison to energies produced from other sources. So, for example, given intermittent and variable energy from renewables, it has a capacity factor. This is how much energy it actually produces over time, not how much it can produce in theory, is at best around 25 to 30%. Whereas coal, even in some of the worst case scenarios, is around 65%. So at least you need twice as much renewable energies to replace every 1 unit of coal. And so this 1 gigawatt that will come on board by sometime next year through the bid window 5 of the REAP is really equal to about 0.3 gigawatts, not even a half a gigawatt. There's also additional problems in relation to private embedded in generation, but I think we can get there in a bit. So the bottom line is to circle back. To deal with the energy crisis, which is an urgent emergency, we have to fix Eskom, which has 19 gigawatts of capacity that can be restored, of which we need 6 very quickly. And to do that, we need to really intensify the maintenance and liberate the resources to invest in the maintenance of the existing fleet.
Trevor, I mean, the reality that Dominic has just painted, when both government and Eskom say they're actually alive to that reality, and part of the efforts that they're engaged in are meant to actually address those shortcomings. So in other words, it's not for lack of trying. Or do you differ with them on that?
We absolutely differ with them. We think, in the first place, the main drive for the people who are currently managing Eskom, but also those who are leading our government, the Ministry of Public Enterprises, but also the Ministry of Resources and Energy. Our view is that they would have highlighted in the past their intentions to privatize energy provision in the country. And the warnings, which they even included in the white paper on energy in 1998, showed that there would be at a later stage the increased population, which would necessarily increase demand on energy. And as a result, Eskom has to be prepared to be able to meet that energy demand when population grows. And we will see from 98, 99 until 2006, but also maybe this point, the first point which they also highlighted there, which I must not forget, is that they wanted to introduce competition in the generation division of Eskom itself. So in other words, what they are currently bringing through the independent power producers is what they would have planned a while back. But in the process of doing that, they would have neglected building generation capacity for Eskom, hoping that they will rope in independent power producers who will eventually ensure that the Eskom electricity needs in the country are met. But what would have happened in the early 2000s, because capitalist enterprises are always driven by profit, what would have happened is that they were looking for these investments to come from outside. But because of the historical efficiency of Eskom at the time, the electricity, the cost of electricity in the country was so low. And it was so low compared to the international tariffs on electricity. And as a result, it could not attract the necessary investment from private producers. And that is the reason why you even see the exponential growth in the electricity tariffs, because what they are doing with that also is to try to attract these independent power producers into the grid to invest in the electricity generation in the country.
But what relevance is that history, though? I mean,
it's completely irrelevant.
We are where we are right now. Should we be dealing with what we're confronted with right now?
No, it's completely irrelevant, because we have to understand what resulted in the situation that caused Eskom to have the multiple crisis that it's facing today, the crisis of its debt, the crisis of generation capacity and load shedding. And as Trevor indicated, boils down to effectively a couple of key points. One, it was the 1998 white paper that put a moratorium on Eskom generating any additional capacity until bad investments of Medupi and Kusile. And with this bad investments, you have it with international finance institutions, including the World Bank, who's given what is effectively a corrupt loan to Eskom, which we'll have to pay back over the next 100 years. So part of Eskom's financial crisis is because of this. Part of the fact that Eskom can't produce sufficient energy today is related to this. Then Trevor makes a second very critical point, which is the adoption of the corporatization of Eskom in 2001, where Eskom, which is a public utility, must then act like a private company. And when you put this in the context of mass unemployment and gross inequalities, end users are actually unable to pay. So while it's important to think about those who are using tons of electricity to reduce wasteful energy, it's not going to be enough to meet the energy shortfall. And there's so many people who are load shedding themselves already because they can't pay for it. So when you bring this bad investments, the fact that most people can't really afford to pay for energy, and then increased demand for energy over time, as you see the introduction of the IPPs after 2011, it basically creates the process of the Eskom death spiral. This is a manufactured crisis. It's not a crisis that's unique to Eskom. In fact, it's something that's occurred to most public utilities around the world following the adoption of neoliberalism. And so that's why we have to roll back these problematic developments that created these crises to be able to ameliorate them. Otherwise, we won't be able to have long-term energy security. In fact, as we see greater private sector and more competition in the energy sector, will actually accelerate this death spiral, as you see, especially the energy intensive users group, who are about 30 corporations, state and private, who account for about 40% of the total energy consumed in the country. And as they shift to private embedded generation, that means a huge amount of demand is reduced. While Eskom will still have to pay above cost prices for excess supply from this private sector energy producers, even when Eskom has enough energy or if there's not enough demand in the future. And at the same time, Eskom will have to cover all the costs for the investment in the infrastructure for the development of renewable energies. These costs are not considered when spoken about the shift to decarbonize, which once again, AIDC, SAFTU, and many others feel that it's critical that we do to address the problem of climate change. But in fact, and I should end here, whilst there's many other points to raise, not only does, and we can show why, not only does government's proposals put our whole energy system in jeopardy, it actually also puts the possibilities of decarbonizing the South African energy sector at risk, given our research on the unfolding situation and problems of the for-private renewable energy sector globally.
Trevor, do you have a problem with the heavy energy users group? The fact that, I mean, they actually have the capacity, I'm speaking to them next, to bring in more into the grid. Shouldn't that be welcomed?
We have a problem, first and foremost, in relation to privatization of state-owned enterprises and any smuggling of enterprises through the back door of these independent power producers introduced in the generation division of Eskom is problematic, and we must at least try to elaborate why is this problematic. The first point we make is that, you see, the problems of, and I'll always come to this, the problems of the capitalist enterprises, which are predicated on profiteering, would present us with many long-term problems. But the short-term immediate problems, which we already see, for instance, Vusiswe Mabuso wrote an opinion piece on the Business Day yesterday. And in it, actually, she reveals that these people are not going to, because what we're sold as a public is that the competition between these independent power producers will push prices down, and as a result, the cost of electricity will go down and be cheaper. But that is not true, because what Vusiswe actually showed there is that they went to bid in the tendering for bid window 5 with 43 cents per kilowatt per hour, right? But immediately after that, they are now crying that the costs of assembling input costs, it is actually at about 44% higher than what they've bid with. Now, as a result, they are going to demand increases on the unit cost of electricity they are selling to Eskom. And of course, that will be factored into electricity prices which are sold to consumers at the end of the day, which will lead to a consumer prices skyrocketing. This is the first part. The second part is in the long term. In the long term, you see, once they dismantle Eskom by decommissioning some of its coal fleets, and eventually the generation market is dominated by the independent power producers, what you will then have is that because capitalism has a tendency of concentration, eventually these smaller bidders who are currently competing amongst one another will be swallowed by one or two oligopolies, and eventually those will be the price makers. And instead of having a public entity that is a monopoly, you will have a private entities which are monopolies and oligopolies, and as a result, price makers always, by interest of profit, will always shoot up the roof the prices of electricity for the consumers and the working class.
Chairman, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to leave it here for tonight. Thanks to both of you for coming through. Dominic Brown from the Alternative Information Development Center, and of course, Trevor Shaku from SAFTU, the Union Federation. Now, many of you will recall the announcement President Cyril Ramaphosa made